Well, thanks everyone for coming. I suspect you're all pretty familiar with death certificates from any genealogical work you've done yourselves, and also, of course, the work with the U3A project. But we thought it would be useful and hopefully interesting to give you a little talk about the origins of death certificates and civil registration. Sorry. Um, and how historians have tended to use death certificates and the sort of problems and challenges that they pose. So the death certificates that you have been looking at arise from the 1836 Registration Act. But although this is the start of civil registration in the United Kingdom, there have been forms of individual level registration in Britain since at least the 16th century, when Thomas Cromwell instructed Anglican bishops to ensure that all baptisms, marriages and funerals were recorded. But it's only with the passing in 1836 of this act and that a universal civil system of vital registration started. The impetus behind the 1836 Act was a desire that lineage was accurately recorded to ensure that property rights could be adequately protected, as so often in British history it all comes down to property. This is a period when the land market is in increasing flux. Property was being disposed of in ever more complex fashion through wills and through marriage settlements. And those factors, combined with the general level of economic uncertainty in the first half of the 19th century, meant that it was increasingly thought that the existing system of parochial registration was inadequate. For one thing, it wasn't universal, and it wasn't universal for a couple of reasons. One of which was it's only really an Anglican system, so dissenters, Catholics, and so forth weren't really covered by it. Second of all, you had to pay fees to register any baptism, marriage, or funeral. So there was an element of sort of socio-economic disadvantage in it. And there's also the fact that it registered, the existing system didn't register vital events. It took note of the religious ceremonies. So it registered baptism rather than birth, and it registered funeral rather than death. And there could be quite significant periods of time between those two events. So there was an increasing feeling that the system wasn't fit for purpose, and the select committee was set up. And you can see the quotes that they have here from the select committee in 1833, saying that the existing system provided no adequate proof of pedigree or means of proving or tracing ancestral descent. The value of property is diminished by the difficulties incident to its transfer and the insecurity with which it is so often held and acquired. So it was passed in 1836, registration started at the beginning of 1837, and the Act was subsequently amended in 1856 and then 1874. Now that only applied to England and Wales. In Scotland, it took rather longer to be introduced, and you can see there were a whole series of bills for civil registration brought before Parliament in the 1820s, 30s and 40s, but they all failed, and that was mainly because each of those bills included some quite controversial attempts to reform marriage law in Scotland, and civil registration as a consequence was rather damned by association. In 1854, they got rid of those marriage reforms, and it passed. The Scottish Act is quite similar to the English Act in many respects, although it's notable that the Scottish certificates have a great deal more information recorded on them. Indeed, so much information that they proved to be rather unwieldy. And when the bill was amended in 1855, they dropped quite a lot of that information. In Ireland, where Ireland's gone. There we go. In Ireland, it took even longer to get civil registration introduced. There was an 1844 Marriage Act that stipulated that all non-Catholic marriages in Ireland had to be registered, but full civil registration wasn't passed until 1863. Again, there were a number of attempts to get a civil registration bill passed in the 1840s, 50s, and early 60s. They mainly failed because of disagreements in Westminster between the Liberal and the Conservative parties over how the administrative structure of the Irish civil registration was meant to be organised. Liberals wanted it based on the existing poor law administrative systems. The Conservatives favoured basing it around the police. The 1863 Act passed, and it was the Liberals basically won out, so it was based around the poor law, and that was mainly done for budgetary constraints. Again, it was amended this time in 1880. And once again, the certificates and much of the Act itself is very similar to the English and Welsh Acts. So if that's a very, very quick précis of the origins of civil registration in the United Kingdom and how it varied from country to country, I now want to turn briefly to the process of how you actually registered a death in the 19th century, which again also varied slightly between the four kingdoms. In England and Wales, notice that every death had to be given to the local registrar within 5 days of it happening. The individual who reported the death was known as the informant, and he was, quote, he or she was, quote, some person present at the death or in attendance during the last illness. Now, that's often a relative or a family member, but it could also be someone residing in the same household or nearby. The informant would go to the registrar and would give them the deceased's name, date of death, age, gender, occupation, and so forth. The registrar would then issue a certificate which authorised burial. Now, burials could happen in England and Wales without a certificate, but in those cases, the person officiating the ceremony had to inform the registrar of the death within 7 days, or they would be fined £10. And at the bottom, you can just see the information that you get on an English and Welsh death certificate. The cause of death data, which is included, was provided by the informant to the registrar, and it could come from a number of different sources. Ideally, according to the General Register Office, a medical professional would certify the death, provide a cause of death, often written on a certificate provided for that purpose. They would give that to the informant, who would then pass it on to the registrar. But often, in many cases, the deceased hadn't been attended by a medical professional at the time of their death, and so the cause of death was simply supplied by whoever happened to report it, and the death was described as being uncertified in those cases. In Scotland and Ireland, the process was very similar, but there was one major difference. Whereas in England and Wales, as I've just said, the medical certificate was first given by the doctor to the informant, and then by the informant to the registrar. In Ireland and Scotland, the medical physician or practitioner who was certifying the death would directly pass the medical certificate to the registrar, cutting out family members or whoever else is informing on the death. And that has some interesting impacts on the kind of causes of death that you get in Ireland and Scotland, which I'll discuss a bit later. And then the only other thing is to note just how much more detailed the Scottish death certificates are. And again, you can see that here on this slide. The top example is the information you get from Scotland. Although, as I said, some of that was dropped very soon after. So, why are we interested in death certificates? And why are we interested in the processes and the legislation behind them and how they're created? Well, it's because death certificates have been used by historians extensively to make really quite grand and significant claims about the nature of population history, the nature of the economy, and indeed, quite grand universal claims as to sort of laws of demographic behaviour. In general, what has happened for England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland is that the data from the death certificates actually cannot be accessed on a large scale by historians or other academics who want to use it. So they have to use the information as published by each country's General Register Office. And the General Register Office is the body set up by each of the Civil Registration Acts to administer the system of civil registration. The data from death certificates was processed by each of these GROs and then published in annual reports in various formats. The data have proved to be very useful for historians, and they've allowed graphs like these on the screen to be produced. The first, on the left, shows how different causes of deaths varied by age in England and Wales in the 1860s. And you can see, well, hopefully you can just about see that most of these causes of death peak at very young ages and at very old ages, apart from tuberculosis, which is here as phthisis, which I can never say properly, which actually peaks in the 20s, 30s and 40s. That's the single black line. The second graph on the right shows how the incidence of different causes of death changed in Scotland between the 1850s and the 1950s. And here you can see the relatively dramatic fall of most kinds of cause of death here. So that's respiratory TB and other TB are both declining. Pneumonia has a quite interesting pattern of slowly rising and peaking at the start of the 20th century and then declining. And then you can see the steady on march of cancer. But the data that these seemingly very stark and revealing graphs are based on has to be used very carefully, because there are a number of issues that affect the quality of data, and they tend to take three forms. First is under registration. The second is the issue of certification, and the third is how causes of death are defined and classified. So under registration, then, it's not really thought to be a problem in England and Wales, although there hasn't been a great deal of study of whether that's actually true. It is thought to be a bit more of a severe problem in Scotland, in areas that are quite remote. So obviously, although gravediggers and others could be fined for burying people whose deaths hadn't been registered, there are large parts of the Highlands and Islands where there were no undertakers or gravediggers, and church officials tended to be at a distance. And there was a general feeling that crofters and the like took a quite proprietary approach to the local graveyards and would bury people without registering them. Whether this was actually true is debatable, but you can see here an 1856 quotation from the Scottish General Register Office Examiner saying, unfortunately, it often happens that there are no church officers, and even when there are, parties frequently break open the gate, dig the grave, and bury the dead in spite of all opposition. The issue, however, was definitely a problem in Ireland, where substantial numbers of deaths weren't registered. And you can see here in Dublin, in the 1860s, you've got nearly 10% of all deaths not being registered. And it's a problem that continued right through the 20th century. There was a study of deaths in 1992 in County Meath that was finding 11.5% of deaths not being registered. The reason for this high degree of non-compliance is not entirely understood, but probably relates to the close association I mentioned earlier between the Irish system of civil registration and the Irish Poor Law. Poor law unions were used as the districts of administration, the registration districts, and the administrators of civil registration were usually drawn from poor law staff. And given that the Irish poor law was rather unpopular amongst much of the population, given its association with the British state and with the Great Famine in particular, you can see why they would have rather lower levels of compliance. The second issue then is the certification of causes of death. So this is the proportion of all deaths that were registered, looking at whether the cause of death provided was given by a medical practitioner, that is to say it was a certified death, or whether it was given by a layperson, so that would be medically uncertified. And the map you can see here is of England and Wales for 1890, and the different shadings are different levels of medical certification in each county, although Wales is just split into North and South Wales in the reports that I took these figures from. Basically, the darker the area, the higher the level of uncertified deaths there were. Over the course of the century, the degree of medical certification in England and Wales improved quite a bit. So there's a bullet point there that shows, 80% of deaths were certified in 1860. By the end of our period, it had risen to nearly 100%, 97.7. But even later in the century, when the overall national picture is pretty good in terms of certification, the geographical variation was quite stark, as you can hopefully see on this map. In general, certification was much better in urban than rural areas. And the reasons for this geographical variation are mainly about access to medics. And that's both in terms of whether there's actually a medic anywhere near you, and that explains partly why rural areas are worse, have lower levels of certification. But it's also about whether you could afford it. So there's a socio-economic aspect as well. It should also be noted that it was also more common for very young or very old deaths to not be certified. In Scotland, the data is a bit sparser, but there definitely seems to have been an improvement at the national level, dropping from about 11% in 1880 uncertified to 5.8% in 1890. But again, there's a lot of geographical variation, as again, hopefully you can see from this map, which once again is for 1890. And shows that actually the degree of certification varied a great deal in Scotland, and that the range was very high as well. So, in Orkney, you're up to over 50% of deaths not having a medical certification. And I think this is, again, very starkly shows that it's really about access to medical professionals. Even in places where there was quite a high number of medics per population, as there often was on some of the Scottish islands, just the ruggedness and difficulty of the terrain meant that often people weren't attended to. And so the causes of death couldn't be provided by a medic. In Ireland, again, the data is less good, so can't give you the same period. But here's a map for 1911, which once again shows the very stark geographical variation from pretty low levels of uncertified deaths in Dublin and near Belfast, and then very high in the west of Ireland, in Galway and so forth. The Registrar General in Ireland put this down to Irish reluctance to seek medical advice for chronic illnesses. Or for the very old, which may be part of it. But again, I think this issue of access to medical care is clearly really important. What this means for Irish death statistics is that, combined with the difficulties of unregistered deaths and the problems with certification, mean that cause of death data in Ireland has to be used very carefully indeed. Now, even where the cause of death is provided and it was certified, there can still be problems. If a physician was called to see someone at the very end of their life, or even after someone had died, and to give a cause of death, then the kinds of causes that they provide are going to be very different from deaths where the physician has attended to the patient for a long period of time. And again, that adds in a socio-economic element to this, undoubtedly. The General Register Office in each country was also very concerned with the fact that doctors were giving too many general causes of death. Too often they were just writing old age or tumour or inflammation in the cause of death. And they tried throughout the 19th century with some success to really drive down the number of unspecific causes given. And this graph here shows that. So this is for England and Wales. This is the percentage of all deaths registered in each year that were given unspecified causes. So you can see that it falls from about 11 or 12% in the end of the 1850s. It falls down to less than 6% by the 1900s. And a lot of that is down to innovations by the GRO itself. So William Ogle, who was superintendent of statistics for the English and Welsh GRO in the 1880s, created a system whereby ambiguously worded medical certificates were sent back to the medics that had provided them for clarification about what they actually referred to. The kinds of death can also depend on changes in scientific terminology at the time. And these changed a lot over the period that we're particularly interested in. And they changed in two ways. The GROs in each country used different classifications of causes of death. And they changed independently of each other over time. So the Scottish one is different from the English and Welsh one. But it was also about the diffusion of medical knowledge, which changed the kinds of causes that doctors gave. So again, returning to William Ogle, in 1885, he noted that deaths from kidney disease had increased by 83% over the last 20 years. Now, he didn't think this was just because lots and lots more people were dying from kidney disease. It was that the medical profession was starting to become familiar with some relatively recent work by Richard Bright on identifying kidney disease. And because doctors had this new knowledge, they were classifying diseases that once would have been assigned to another cause, to the cause of kidney disease. Now, even where the terminology can be familiar to us, there can also be problems because the historical definition of certain terms would be very different. So rheumatism is a good one. In England and Wales, up until 1911, rheumatism, where it appears in the General Register Office's reports, includes both what we would normally call rheumatism, sort of chronic pain caused by following from infections, to also something called rheumatism of the heart, which is a form of heart disease that has a similar cause, but is generally not grouped together with rheumatism in more modern cases. And indeed, after 1911, they moved rheumatism of the heart to be classified under valvular diseases. So it becomes very difficult to construct a long-run statistical series which can show you how rheumatism varied from 1850 to 1950, for example. And finally, the cause of death can be influenced by social factors. As I mentioned earlier, in England and Wales, the medical certificate was passed from the doctor to the family member to the registrar. So there was a tendency to avoid writing embarrassing or otherly stigmatized causes of death on medical certificates. And you can actually see this in the statistics. If you look at the proportion of deaths attributed to alcoholism or sexually transmitted infections in England and Wales in the 19th century and compare that to Scotland, they're much lower in England and Wales than they were in Scotland. And there's no real reason to think that the incidence would actually be very different. So doctors are just avoiding writing this and presenting it to a family member and saying, sorry, your loved one died because of alcoholism or syphilis or something along those lines. So finally, just to bring this full circle and back to the Addressing Health project, why are we interested in death certificates? Well, it's so we can produce tables like this one, which draws from the pilot study that David, Doug and Kathleen did. This is the causes of death for 219 postal workers, and I've divided them here into the causes of those who retired for medical reasons and those who retired because of old age. And you can see that there are some quite interesting differences. So the first one, which is very stark, is right at the top there, people dying from TB. The medical retirements, nearly a quarter of those that retired for medical reasons then died of TB. And the reason for that is because they mainly retired because they had TB. And it kills them relatively quickly afterwards. And the second one, just I want to pull out, is old age, which is the fourth one down. And that's the cause of death on a rather large number of old age retirements, but on far fewer medical retirements. This is an example of those ill-defined causes of death that the GRO really hated. and it includes things like general decay or infirmity of age. And that simply reflects the fact that those that retired for ill health reasons retired far earlier and died earlier, at a younger age, than those who retired for age reasons. So the average age of ill health retirees to die at was 62.7 years, and for those retiring due to old age, it was 76.3 years. And there's much more that could be said about this table, but we can discuss that in the questions if people are interested. So in this very brief talk, I've tended to stress the problems that arise from the ways that deaths were registered and how death certificates were produced in 19th century United Kingdom. But I don't want to give you the impression that the statistics generated from them are worthless or untrustworthy. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending all this time looking at them. With suitable care, cause of death data from certificates can be used to construct very useful and interesting statistical series that can tell us a great deal about the incidence of disease and mortality in the past. But also studying the processes by which death certificates are created and causes of death are diagnosed can tell us a lot about how the medical profession functioned in the past, something which the project is also very interested in. So how did individual doctors diagnose particular conditions, and how were those diagnoses affected by their age, by their gender, by the doctor's education and their working practices? So death certificates are, therefore, a complex but an invaluable source for historical scholarship. And I'll finish it there. I will stop sharing, and thank you very much for coming.